AT&T. I wanted to focus on how this company started because it's so often overlooked. Its roots go all the way back to Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, so already I think that's enough reason to take a look at what was going on back then. You probably already knew that, right? Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, but would you be able to tell me anything beyond that one sentence? My guess is most of us can't, and that's why I wanted to focus on it. Plus, there's a lot of crazy stuff here. I can almost guarantee that his motivation to invent the telephone was based on the fact that this entire family was concerned with sound and hearing. Let me tell you about the Bell family. The names can get confusing. His father was named Alexander Melville Bell, obviously very similar to Alexander Graham Bell, and in fact, the son didn't even have that middle name for the first 11 years of his life. Apparently, he received it as a birthday present. His mother was named Eliza, and he had two brothers named Edward and Melville. I say they were concerned with sound and hearing because his mother was almost deaf, and his father, as a profession, taught elocution to the deaf. He even developed this alphabet/writing system called visible speech that was used to help the deaf learn how to speak. Alexander Graham Bell would follow in his father's footsteps by also working as a teacher to the deaf. I thought this was funny. Do you know how everyone loves to talk about how people like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of college? Some college students even try to use that to justify their own situation. Well, go ahead and add Alexander Graham Bell to that list. He actually dropped out of high school when he was 15, but later was still smart enough to pass an entrance exam to get into college, and then dropped out of college. I guess he was just unchallenged in high school and couldn't stick to the curriculum, but wait until you hear the reason he dropped out of college. It said his younger brother, Edward, died of tuberculosis when he was 19, and then his older brother, Melville, died of tuberculosis when he was 25. All of that tragedy motivated the family to relocate from London to Canada. However, Alexander Graham Bell wouldn't stay there for long. He quickly moved to the New England area, where he would continue teaching at various schools for the deaf. A deaf student of his at one of these schools, Mabel Hubbard, would later become his wife. They met when she was 15 and he was 25, and they got married 4 years later. Say what you will about that situation, but the reason I mention it is because Mabel's father, Gardiner Hubbard, was actually one of the founders of that school and had enough money to be an important early investor in Alexander's inventions. The idea for the telephone was based on the telegraph, and I'm not a scientist, so I can't even begin to talk about the science behind all of this, but the electric telegraph was a fairly new invention, invented in part by Samuel Morse about 30 years ago, and it provided a way for people to quickly communicate long distances. Obviously, it wasn't the ideal way of communicating. It sent electric signals and used Morse code, but it got the job done, and it was a big deal in the mid-1800s. The biggest company in the telegraph business was Western Union, at the time known as Western Union Telegraph Company. There were a bunch of scientists competing to improve this invention. It had to do with transmitting multiple messages over the same line. This guy, Joseph Stearns, figured out how to transmit 2 of them on the same line, and then Western Union hired Thomas Edison to figure out how to do more of them. He ultimately figured out how to do it with 4. Well, Alexander Graham Bell was one of these scientists, competing to develop improvements to the telegraph. His father-in-law, I already told you about, Gardiner Hubbard, saw potential and provided funding for Alexander to continue with his experiments. Through his efforts to improve the telegraph, he figured out a way to transmit music and soon after a person's voice. He filed for that patent on February 14th, 1876, and it was awarded to him 3 weeks later. 3 days after that, he delivered the first ever understandable voice message through the telephone when he called his assistant and said, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." And this is interesting too. Here's a small clip of Watson's real voice.
I first met Alexander Graham Bell in 1874.
I should mention that this patent is surrounded by controversy. There's this other scientist, Elisha Gray, that was working on similar things independent of Bell that made similar breakthroughs virtually at the same time. It appears that he was just a little too slow in filing his patent. Alexander has been forced to defend his patent through hundreds of lawsuits, notable ones being from Gray and Western Union. The end result of the Western Union lawsuit was an out-of-court settlement that basically said Bell's companies could handle the telephone business if they promised to let Western Union handle the telegraphs. But either way, Alexander Graham Bell was now the one who held this patent for the telephone. That's pretty big. Imagine being in that situation. You hold the exclusive rights to an invention that has the potential to change the world, but how do they capitalize on it? It's not as simple as opening a store and selling some telephones. There's a whole system that needs to be put into place. Well, about a year later, they organized the Bell Telephone Company. Hubbard was now his father-in-law and an early investor. He received 30% ownership. Thomas Sanders was a wealthy merchant of leather that knew Bell through his daughter, who was one of his deaf students. He became a significant investor and also received 30% ownership. Alexander himself received 30%, and then Thomas Watson, his assistant, received the last 10%. And this is actually about the last we hear of Alexander Graham Bell. He's the genius behind the invention that started the company, but sold his shares in it pretty early on and wasn't really a significant part of it beyond that. So all these guys formed a separate company called New England Telephone Company the following year. The mission of that one was to license telephone exchanges throughout New England. These are telephone exchanges where the operator connects your calls. It's needed in order for the telephone to work. The phones are useless without them. They would continue doing this heavily for the next few years until they were established in most of the major cities across the country. Think of this as a weird version of how fast food chains expand. It's expensive to open and operate a new company-owned Little Caesars location, but if they franchise it by licensing someone else the rights to use their name and sell their food, it's much cheaper and easier. That's what they were doing here with these local operating companies. It's hard to open dozens of them across the country, but it's easy to issue licenses that allow other companies to do it. The contracts they had in place were for 5 to 10 years and gave Bell the rights to buy the other party's property at the end of the contract. Over time, they would become a significant owner in most of these companies. In 1878, the two merged into a single company called National Bell Telephone Company. In 1880, they became the American Bell Telephone Company. Since they were so in control of these local operating companies, they started establishing long-distance lines. They acquired a manufacturing company called Western Electric to provide them with the necessary equipment to do that. In 1884, they famously built a line that connected Boston and New York. In 1885, they formed a subsidiary specifically intended to manage their long-distance business. The subsidiary was named American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or AT&T. 14 years later, they restructured a bit, and AT&T became the parent company and the name of the entire business. Now, that original patent gave them the exclusive right to establish the telephone business. Well, in 1884, that patent expired, and the competition came flooding in. Obviously, AT&T made pretty good use of their time that was protected by that patent, so they were already pretty tough competition for any independent company looking to enter that market. Notably, they owned Western Electric, which was basically the only manufacturer of telephone equipment. Since they owned it, they refused to sell anything to any other company. They also had a monopoly on the long-distance lines. Those things are hard to establish, and they wouldn't let any other company take advantage of them. There were huge barriers for any other company looking to compete, but their hope came in two main forms. For one, AT&T stuck mostly to urban areas, so there was still plenty of the less populated areas around the country without existing phone lines. And for two, well, no one liked AT&T. Their size and lack of competition allowed them to get away with high prices and bad customer service and just an overall negative public image. But the customers were forced to put up with it, or they couldn't have a telephone, and obviously they wanted a telephone. The next decade or so consisted of numerous smaller competitors taking advantage of these shortcomings and nudging their way into the industry any way they could. AT&T was retaliating by raising capital and going deep into debt so they could aggressively continue expanding. Remember, everyone wanted a telephone. The market was expanding like crazy, and it was a race to capture all of these new customers. Major changes happened in 1907. AT&T's market share had been reduced to just under half. There were some changes in ownership that led to new leadership within the company. Theodore Vail took over as president. He was actually a leader of the company 18 years earlier, but left for a while, and now he was back. He is generally credited with turning this tide. He improved their public image image, in part by putting a much-needed emphasis on customer service. He also emphasized long-term success rather than immediate profits. He implemented this research and development plan that eventually led to Bell Labs, which is a big thing. He also wanted AT&T to return to a monopoly. The company aggressively started acquiring all of these independent competitors. In 1910, they actually bought 30% of Western Union. They were also being aggressive in acquiring these local operating companies that were operating under their license, growing a concern of a vertical monopoly. They were getting too big, and the United States government generally isn't too tolerant of growing monopolies, which led to the Kingsbury Commitment. It was a settlement with the government that didn't really prevent the monopoly in the way that you would hope. The agreement said that they had to get rid of their share of Western Union, and they had to allow independent companies to utilize their long-distance lines, but that was about it. The New York Times and many others have called this a government-approved monopoly. It was broken up in the 1980s after a decade of court battles, but there you have it. That's how the company started. That's how one of the biggest inventions of all time came to be, and the journey of how the company that was built from that invention became a government-approved monopoly of the industry. Let me know in the comments. What do you think of all this? We've all learned that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, but I thought it was interesting to take a bit of a closer look. That invention, and the way it was handled early on, established a company that no one can compete with. A company that we all still know today, over 100 years later. In fact, I didn't even talk about anything that AT&T has done over the past 100 years. And a lot has happened, so if you're interested in a follow-up about some of that, let me know. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.